Topic 34, the Gilded Age, 1870 to 1900. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, since you'll need to take them in order to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you'll be able to define the Gilded Age by identifying its rough start and end points, by describing its salient socioeconomic and cultural characteristics, define the term robber baron, and identify at least 3 major industrialists of the era, and analyze the influence of the federal government in promoting the interests of business and in preventing the rise of labor unions during the period. The Civil War introduced tremendous change to American life, not just in the relationship between the North and the South, or between the government and African Americans, but also between the federal government and big business. As we've explored in earlier podcasts, part of the reason that the North was able to win the Civil War was due to its superior manufacturing and transportation sectors. This industrial strength was born in part by a federal government instituting policies favorable to such industries. For example, Congress kept tariffs on imported goods high, leading American consumers to purchase American manufacturers, which were thus cheaper thanks to the tariffs. Congress also gave away enormous tracts of public lands to railroad companies and kept taxes on most big corporations very low. After the Civil War, the Supreme Court also decided a series of cases like the 1886 Wabash v. Illinois in favor of business. And even when Congress did pass laws intended to curtail the monopolistic tendencies of Gilded Age corporations, the executive branch applied those laws against labor unions instead of big business. These business-friendly practices continued after the Civil War during the Gilded Age, the 30 or so year period up until 1900. The term Gilded Age was coined by one of the period's most well-known authors, Mark Twain. The word gilded means something that contains a thin layer of gold on its surface, but underneath, the object is hollow or worth much less than gold. For Twain, this word, gilded, conveyed the appropriate connotation for a period that often boasted enormous wealth to the outside, but underneath lay great suffering. 3 key factors allowed the owners and shareholders of corporations to amass this enormous wealth during the Gilded Age. First, as we have just mentioned, the federal government actively assisted this process by imposing tariffs, keeping corporate taxes low, granting land to railroad companies, permitting legal structures that allowed businesses to grow very large, and lending the National Guard to states and companies during strikes to break up the power of workers' unions. Although this period of big business is often called laissez-faire capitalism, it's clear that government was not at all absent from the economy. Instead, the federal government took an active role in helping the owners of corporations amass great wealth. New technologies and business practices also enabled industrialists and corporations to achieve new levels of wealth. Andrew Carnegie, for example, adapted the Bessemer process to make steel out of iron in a cheaper, more efficient manner. Carnegie also vertically integrated his production, meaning that he controlled the supply of all the raw materials in the process to make his steel, allowing him to exert greater control over his costs and ultimately the price of his steel. These 2 innovations helped him to eventually crush his competitors. New technologies in transportation, in particular, enabled goods to be shipped more quickly, driving prices down. In 1869, for example, a gold spike connected the Union Pacific and Central Pacific railroads, connecting east and west coasts. New York's Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, stands as another engineering feat of the age. One of the oldest suspension bridges in the country, the Brooklyn Bridge connects Manhattan and the borough of Brooklyn across the East River. The men walking across the bridge in this photograph give a clue as to the final reasons why corporations were able to amass such phenomenal wealth during the Gilded Age. Low-cost labor allowed profit to be put back into research and development and the owner's bank accounts. This labor came from the US and abroad. As technology like tractors and barbed wire enabled even farmers and ranchers to do more with less manpower, many rural Americans found their way to urban centers to build skyscrapers or manufacture steel. Likewise, natural disasters, religious persecution, or industrialization abroad forced foreigners from their homeland to seek jobs in the United States. Chinese and Irish often laid the railroad track, while Eastern Europeans manned Carnegie steel plants in Pittsburgh, and Southern Italians formed the construction crews of New York City. These immigrants and domestic migrants often worked 12 to 14-hour days in dangerous, unhealthy conditions. When they struck for better pay, their protests sometimes turned violent. Before 1900, each of the major strikes was broken, sometimes with the help of federal militarized forces like the National Guard. With cheap, abundant labor from rural America and the rest of the world, Gilded Age industrialists were able to skimp on paying their workers fairly and pocket profits for themselves. These industrialists then lived lavish lifestyles, evoking the word gilded in Twain's moniker. They built mansions along Manhattan's Fifth Avenue and the coast of Newport, Rhode Island, trying to rival the aristocracy and royalty of Europe. It's easy to understand then why the likes of Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and the Vanderbilts have been called robber barons. Many Americans believe that in trying to emulate European nobility like dukes, princes, and barons, these men robbed money out of the mouths of their workers and their families. The robber barons, however, viewed the situation differently, of course. In his 1889 article, The Gospel of Wealth, Andrew Carnegie wrote that it was the duty of industrialists to amass wealth and then give it away to philanthropic causes to uplift the lives of the poor who, because of their lack of education and refinement, would squander money had it been distributed to them in the form of higher wages. Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and the nation's other robber barons thus funded and built a legion of libraries, museums, concert halls, universities, and other institutions intended to benefit the public good. And while many of these venues still stand, providing art and education to the millions who have used them since the Gilded Age, one must wonder whether they justify the impoverishment of the millions of workers and working class families who suffered for this cause.